I don't want to alarm anyone, but the next time the Kraken take the ice, it's for real. What's cracking, everybody? We're back with some more Seattle Kraken R&R, or recap and reaction, this time for the remainder of the preseason that we haven't had a chance to talk about on this channel yet. Of course, we did the first ever Kraken R&R for the first ever Kraken game against the Vancouver Canucks to start out the preseason, which did turn out to be a Kraken win 5-3 in what was a mismatched game as far as the rosters were concerned, with Seattle rolling out a much more NHL heavy lineup, while the Canucks definitely had quite a bit more of their younger guys playing. Then we had the first live watch along stream for that first away game against Edmonton, which definitely didn't go particularly well, but again, this was one with a big roster mismatch, this time with Edmonton rolling out pretty much their starting lineup, and the Kraken rolling out, well, vastly majority AHLers. And when you roll out a lineup like that against Edmonton's top six, yeah, I think 6-0 is about what we could have expected. So then the first real decent look that we got at an NHL heavy lineup for Seattle facing off against an NHL heavy lineup for an opponent was the next game, their second away one in Calgary. And this game, as the two lineups would kind of suggest, ended up being just about as close as I think this race could be between these two teams during the regular season, ending up in a Seattle win 4-3 in the shootout. But of course, the main story for this game was the first return to Calgary for Mark Giordano. Now, we probably will be going through that whole song and dance of Giordano's first return to Calgary when they go to Calgary for the first time in the regular season, but they still did give him a warm welcome, both the fans with Gio chants and also the Flames players who welcome back their old captain in true hockey fashion with a couple of pretty decent hits on him early in the first period, though he was sure to respond, opening up the scoring in the game with his first goal as a Kraken, making the game 1-0 Seattle. And by the end of regulation, Jaden Schwartz had managed to add 2 goals of his own, though Calgary was able to tie things up late in the third, meaning it went 3-3 and we got our first look at 3-on-3 overtime. Of course, no one scored in that overtime, and we ended up going to a shootout that this time actually meant something, where the Kraken did end up pulling out the win. Of course, I say meant something rather loosely there, as it was still a preseason game, so wins and losses don't really matter, but even in the preseason, a win still does feel better than a loss, especially for a new team like the Kraken. Then it was back home for the last 2 home games of the preseason in a back-to-back against Edmonton and then Calgary, which unfortunately to me ended up being probably the 2 most disappointing games of the preseason. I mean, yes, they did end up winning the first of those 2 games in Everett against the Oilers, but that was a game that I really would have liked to see them control play a little bit more, as this time they definitely did have the more NHL heavy lineup than what the Oilers rolled out. But again, they still do end up getting the win, this time in overtime, so it was at least exciting for the fans that were in Everett to see it. Then they followed that up with, to me, probably the most disappointing game of the preseason in Kent against Calgary, which they would end up losing 4-1, in spite of having maybe the edge with lineups, if not fairly equal lineups as far as the number of NHLers that each team was putting out on the ice. Ultimately, this game really came down to a pretty poor performance from Drieger, which, to be fair, he did own up to, though it is fair to mention that the team did play pretty well defensively in front of him, only letting up 13 shots. Unfortunately, though, obviously 4 of those did get through, where only 1 of the 22 shots the Kraken had managed to get past Vladar. But fortunately, last night, or I guess what was last night as of when I'm recording this, they did finish out the preseason on a high note with a 4-0 shutout of the Vancouver Canucks, which, at least for what it's worth between that rivalry geographically speaking, the Kraken are now up 2-0. Though, again, it's preseason and none of that really will count, or no one's going to look at it come the regular season, but still, it's a fun little thing that we have right now. Plus, to be fair, the Canucks didn't have 3 of their best players in Besser and the newly signed Hughes and Pettersson, but still, a win is a win, even if it wasn't necessarily the most pretty win that the Kraken managed to pull out in this one, as for most of the game, especially 5-on-5, the Canucks really had control of most of the play and in most statistical ways played better than the Kraken, but in the one stat that matters, the score, again the Kraken came out on top, largely thanks to an absolutely beautiful performance by Grubauer in net. So in the end, the Kraken finished the preseason 4-2-0. And while, again, yes, it is preseason and the record and points and none of that ends up really mattering as it is all cleared off the board now with less than a week until the regular season where things start up for real. If there's one team in the entire league where this preseason mattered more than the rest, it would be the Kraken, as this was a chance for them not only to get a look at some of their younger players, but also to start to figure out some of that chemistry and practice some things they hadn't necessarily had a chance for, like the power play and penalty kill, which, especially the power play, got a pretty good amount of practice in that last game against the Canucks. And when it comes to that, for what it's worth, which honestly is probably more than the record itself in the preseason, they did actually seem to get some answers of where some of that chemistry is coming from and where some of those lines will end up falling, at least to start the season. Especially that first line of Schwartz, McCann, and Eberle, where especially McCann and Schwartz seem to have pretty good chemistry between the two of them, being two of the main scorers across the 6 games that the Kraken played. Now, the power play definitely could use a little bit more work before the regular season starts up against Vegas next Tuesday. But again, admittedly, the team did say that was one of the things that in practice they hadn't had as much of a chance to go over, so most of the practice that they've had doing that up till this point has been in those preseason games. And at least to me, it seemed like the power play was actually at its best the way they had it set up in the first game against Vancouver, where they had that first line that, again, seems like where most of the chemistry is in the forward group right now, as well as Donato, who, for what it's worth, was one of the best positive surprises of this preseason, and actually was the guy that was pulling the trigger more often than not on that power play early on. As far as the roster is concerned, as of when I'm recording this right now, they still have 24 guys on NHL contracts signed to the roster and would need to figure out what to do with at least one of them to get down to the 23 maximum. Of course, that's even before you consider the fact that Morgan Geekie isn't one of those 24, and I think he's pretty likely to make that opening day roster, which means they would have to figure out what to do with 2 guys. Now, Yanni Gourde is pretty likely to go on an injured reserve list, at least to start out the season, so that takes care of one of those spots, and then there's the question of what's going on with Blackwell. But still, there might be a defenseman on the move before the season gets started in this next week, and I would still be keeping my eye on either Lauzon or Soucy. As far as lineup is concerned, again, I think you can pretty much lock in that first line of McCann, Eberle, and Schwartz, at least until Yanni Gourde gets back, and then I think he probably slots into that spot, moving McCann down to the second line, but if they've got good chemistry between the 3 of them, I wouldn't necessarily be too surprised to see them put Gourde on the second line, or maybe put Gourde on the first with 2 other guys and move that line down to the second. Of course, keeping in mind that, especially as we go through the rest of the Kraken's potential lines, this is a forward group that is not so heavy on the top end, but is pretty deep and even skill-wise throughout. So things on the forward end for the Kraken might not play out the typical way that you might see from most teams in the league, where the first and second line especially are getting the vast majority of the minutes, and the third and fourth lines don't really see the ice as much. For the Kraken, I think we're going to see things evened out quite a bit more, and the third and fourth line are going to be used mostly just to continue to find that chemistry and see what works. But as far as where we start with those other 3 lines, again, with Gourde out until what looks like it could now be somewhere in mid-November, about a month into the season, I think we could be seeing something similar to what they rolled out against Vancouver, as that very well may have been a test to see if that is where they want to start the season, which means the second line would be Donskoy, Donato, and then centered by Wenberg, which is definitely not what we would have expected coming into preseason, but Donato especially has been one of the biggest pleasant surprises of this preseason, and again, if they can get him into spots to score, he's shown that he can do that. Then the third line, at least the one that they had in that last game against Vancouver, was centered by Geekie with Yarncroke and Appleton on the wings. Now, I do think that especially with this third and fourth line from, again, that last preseason game, we probably will see a lot of switching around of pieces to see what works towards the start of the season and for that first month, and really even probably for the first half of the season. So even if this is the line that they roll out against Vegas in that first game, I don't necessarily think that we can even expect it to be the same line in the second game against Nashville. Personally, I still think that Tanev probably ends up at least on a third line for the Kraken, but again, we'll just have to see where things shake out. At least for that last preseason game, Tanev was playing on that fourth line with Cheyenne and Bastian. And this is definitely where we're going to see guys rotating even in and out of actually actively playing night to night. And obviously, there's still the question of when Blackwell will be back and where he slots in, as I think he probably slots into at least the third line, if not potentially the second, unless they find some chemistry there that they want to stick with. And then, of course, the other guy missing from this who could be the one that slots in for Cheyenne potentially would be Marcus Johansson, though that's certainly not a given, and both of them showed ups and downs during the preseason, so this is going to be kind of a game-to-game play it by ear. But again, especially with the number of back-to-backs that the Kraken especially are going to have this season, and the more condensed schedule with the Olympic break in February, I think we're going to get to see a lot more movement in this roster, especially in the lower lines, than you might typically see in your typical NHL season. So if by the time that first game against Vegas on the 12th rolls around, or even as that first week goes along, you haven't necessarily seen as much as you were expecting to see of some of those guys on the third or fourth line, like Cheyenne or Johansson or Blackwell once he's healthy, then again, it doesn't necessarily mean we won't be seeing a lot of them as the season goes on, as again, they will be looking to give guys breaks with the condensed schedule. And the same will also certainly apply on the defensive end, where I think pretty much the only things you can for sure lock in is the fact that Giordano will be one of the first pair defensemen, and I think Vince Dunn is pretty likely to end up one of the second pair guys. As far as who matches up with them, I think it looks like Alexiak probably ends up on that first pair with Giordano, and Larson on the second pair with Dunn. Though I could see an argument for flipping those two guys so that they play their more natural positions, but again, as far as the way things have looked in the preseason so far, they've given a lot of looks to Giordano and Alexiak, and then Dunn and Larson. But they did also have Giordano play with Larson for a game, and even Hayden Fleury in this last game, though again, I think that was more because they wanted to give Alexiak a break. And then as far as that third pair is concerned, well, at least as far as the roster is concerned right now anyway, assuming neither one of them does get traded in the next week, which I still think there's a decent possibility one of them does, I think you'd have to put in Lauzon and Soucy. Of course, again, there's still going to be a fair amount of turnover as guys get nights off here and there, in which case, especially if one of them were to get traded, either Hayden Fleury or Will Borgen could step in, both of whom I think definitely fit the description of having been pleasant surprises in this preseason. Now, also, they did both have moments here and there where they showed their lack of experience at the NHL level and had plays that may not necessarily be ideal, but still, I think these guys definitely had a lot more to show in the preseason than necessarily may have been expected of them going in. In the end, with this preseason, all in all, even for what it is being just a preseason, I think we got a pretty decent sense of what this team is likely to be like during the regular season. As frustrating as it might be game to game, this is a team that's likely to play a much more defensive game and look to take advantage of the mistakes of their opponent, which is kind of what we saw in that Edmonton game in Everett, which, again, was a game that I said I would kind of like to have seen them take a little bit more control in, but they also managed to keep Edmonton off the board and took advantage of the mistakes when they happened and pulled out the win. There definitely were moments in pretty much every single one of the preseason games where you could tell that the chemistry wasn't necessarily there between all the players just yet, which I think is to be expected and probably will remain the case early on in the regular season, but all in all, there definitely were more pleasant surprises than there were what you could call disappointments. Really, the only two players that I would have liked to see more from and maybe expected to see more from in the preseason would be Mason Appleton and Chris Driedger. Now, Appleton didn't necessarily do anything wrong throughout the preseason or have any big negative standout plays that I can remember, but he also didn't do nearly as much on the other side of things, the positive end, as I was maybe expecting to see him do. Again, it's still preseason, so I'm not going to read too much into it, but I was definitely more excited about what he could offer and didn't really see a ton of it during those 6 games. Driedger definitely had a bit of a rough show in the preseason in the games that he got in for. He had his moments where he definitely looked good, but especially that last game he played against Calgary, even admittedly himself said that it was not his best game and that he has to play better, especially behind the defensive effort that the Kraken put out in front of him. Again, it's just preseason, so I wouldn't read into it too much or worry too much about it, especially considering he is the 1B goalie, and if worst comes to worst and he does have a bit of a regression from what he did last year in Florida, then they can probably lean heavier on Grubauer, especially considering how solid he looked in the preseason games, especially that last one against Vancouver where he pitched a shutout on 38 shots. But on the forward end, Donato, Geekie, and Schwartz were all guys that, in different ways, shined quite a bit more than I was expecting. Schwartz was very productive down in front of the net, getting rebounds and putting them in. Donato, again, like we talked about on that first power play in the first game, was definitely a pretty strong trigger guy and showed off that strong shot that he does have. Plus, they were able to get him in some positions to be able to use it. He did kind of show that defensively he doesn't have as much to offer as maybe most of the rest of the forward group, but again, as long as they can utilize his strengths rather than try to improve more his weaknesses and put him in those positions, he's definitely going to be more of an asset than maybe a lot of people expected. Geekie is probably the one that most people were talking about as one of the bigger, pleasant young surprises of this preseason, even making most of us either forget or definitely admit that we were wrong about the fact that we were disappointed to see the Kraken take Geekie in the expansion draft over defenseman Jake Bean, as so far Geekie has proven that he may very well have been the correct pick by the Kraken there. Meanwhile, on the defensive end, again, the two guys that I had marked down here are ones that we talked about in Will Borgen and Hayden Fleury, both of whom, again, did have those moments where you kind of shake your head a little bit, but all in all, I think definitely did more to benefit themselves than to hurt themselves with their play in those 6 games. But as you should by now be well aware, we are less than a week away from that regular season starting, and the Kraken hitting the ice to play games for real, and finding out just exactly where this big question mark of a team ends up standing. Which players, lines, and pairings don't necessarily pan out the way we would have necessarily liked them to, and which ones perform way beyond expectations, and especially which players end up being those breakout stars, or stars that the Kraken could have in this first season. For me anyway, when it comes to who those breakout players could be, especially when it comes to putting up points, which is something the Kraken will need to figure out how to do, and is probably the biggest question mark on this team, I think it's hard to ignore at this point that Schwartz and McCann are certainly among the front runners when it comes to where we should expect to see that come from. But I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments section, who you see as potential breakout players, what lines or pairings you would like to see, and what maybe this team does with Yanni Gourde when he comes back if that first line is gelling. Otherwise, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. And until next time, which will be no later than October 12th, stay safe out there and go Kraken.